Amy, you are amazing, the queen of technology. Thank you. Thank you for coordinating all of this. And thank you, Forward Movers, for all being here today. I am so honored to be giving this talk. It is by no means a gospel or a set of concrete answers. It is a conversation. It is truly just the beginning of a conversation to open up a dialogue about how we have inherited implicit biases, racist practices, and white supremacy in our arts educational institutions, and how we can begin to identify and dismantle them. I am Shannon Agnew. My pronouns are she, her, and I have 12 years of theatrical education experience. So it is a little bit different than the dance community. So what I have tried to do is iris out and not focus specifically on theater education, but all arts education. So some of this you may find super applicable to your situation. And some of it is kind of a conversation for larger educational institutions as well. So that's dance studios, that is public spheres where we share ideas. And that is how we'll define an educational institution, because it can take on many forms. So I'm here to talk about how we talk to our students and how you can meet your kids where they are, and how the language we use either plays a complicit role in tearing them down or building them up as artists. And as I said, nothing I say is an absolute. Pick the things you want to try, ask questions, and allow yourself to be open. So my definition of language for this specific seminar is any verbal, physical, or implied communication from you to a student. There are lots of different ways that we communicate with students, and not all of them are those direct verbal reactions and interactions. And every way that we communicate with a student forms a portion of that student's identity and their relationship with arts education in general. So it's really important to recognize all portions of language as we talk about communicating from you to a student. It's why sometimes people have a strong reaction to, I'm fine, because we know that there's more to unpack there. So just be aware that we'll also be talking about those implied communications. So before we really jump into our conversation, we are going to talk about the first 5 words. And these are 5 words that will guide how I want you to think about our conversation and how you can create change in your classroom. And in my little corner of the world, and that's what I'll share today, it's about changing through language and the way we think about language. And these 5 words are a call to action, and they are larger than all of us. The 5 words, they're so big they feel like pillars, are plot, plan, organize, strategize, and mobilize. You'll find them at the top of the document. The rapper Killer Mike at an Atlanta press conference addressing the assassination of George Floyd urged the community to do 5 things: plot, plan, organize, strategize, and mobilize. And I want you to anchor into those 5 pillars today. Because to me, those 5 pillars are the perfect embodiment of demystifying empty placations or any ambiguity around the phrase, we're doing the work. Have you heard that phrase thrown around a lot in educational institutions lately? We're doing the work. So these pillars are here to make sure that actionable steps be taken. And I want you to think about what that means to you right now, wherever you find yourself today, whatever emotional state you find yourself in. And I want you to think about how those 5 pillars take any ambiguity around we're doing the work out of the phrase, and they allow you to examine your position of power in arts education to affect change. So we're going to use these 5 pillars to see how we can make forward movement, because over the next hour, as well as the next 4 days, you're going to be offered ideas and concepts and demands from change and action plans from artists who have put in the emotional and mental labor to create cultural contexts and guides and making restorative justice spaces in your lives and your studios. So that way we can properly reflect the world back to itself and properly reflect the world of your students back to themselves in a sustainable and non-damaging way. And that means we have to hold a mirror up to ourselves to see where we are and where we need to go. And holding up that mirror will allow you to create transformative dance spaces that radiate substantial systemic equality laterally out into our community and then onward into the future, because your students are going to take over, and our actions now dictate the kind of artists and citizens they will become and the values of the arts organizations and instructional spaces that they will create. We are the beginning of the end of this cycle of violence we have inherited. And how we do that, we use incredibly specific and knowing communication with our kids. And that's meeting your kids where they're at, teaching them about the spectrum of humanity, autonomy, and expression available to them through your actions. So one of the ways that we do that is obviously language, as we defined. And language is what separates us from any other entity in the universe. If you look at the invention and evolution of our language as a species, you see all of history. And when you unlock language, you see how we have used it to damage each other and hold each other down. And when you unlock that, you unlock your ability to create inclusivity and end that inherited violence that we have in our language. You can unlock the racist problematic past and reclaim power and end that inherited violence that has come down through what we say, one conversation at a time. And in order to do that, you have to be open to it and have a willingness to be corrected. It is a gift to the world and to your spirit to allow yourself space to sit with your discomfort and realize that sometimes we all say the wrong things. Give yourself the space to realize that error, forgive yourself, thank whoever pointed it out to you, and move on. Now, I know that this inherently goes against what we learn as educators, because a lot of the rules that we have set up in our institutions are actually more about complicit control over students and not necessarily to foster great learning environments. For instance, the United States public school educational system was designed after German factories to get students kind of in that mindset that they could be sitting for 8 hours a day, doing the same thing, performing like machines. It's acknowledging systems like that that allow us to change them. So as we navigate through this responsible use of language, there's going to be moments where we get called out for what we have said or what we have done. We're seeing a giant wave of this happen in arts institutions all around the world, because no one wants to be complicit in systems that hurt folks, but we also want to defend ourselves and say, but we're good people, we're on the right side of this. So in those moments where you're experiencing that juxtaposition of ideas, we're going to practice something I call divine defensive-free discomfort. It's the 3 Ds. And that steps for that are you allow yourself to be corrected with gratitude for the person who took the time to correct you, and sit with your emotions about the situation so you can learn and grow from the whole experience. Just think about right now in your studio setting, has a student ever tried to reach out to you, maybe even in a coded or inappropriate way because they didn't have the correct tools to articulate what really the root of the problem was? Because behavior isn't a problem, it is a reflection of the actual issue. So if a student ever reached out to you and they were talking out, they were exhibiting signs of needing something. Did you take the time to practice divine defensive-free discomfort and sit in that discomfort and figure out what the actual root of the problem was? Or did we shut them down to make them less than in our studio spaces? If someone has come to you and corrected you on use of language or brought up a problematic practice in a studio, do we silence that student, or do we support them by practicing divine defensive-free discomfort and sitting in our discomfort together and starting a dialogue about how we can change it? So David Foster Wallace, there is a brilliant writer and English professor, and he shared a little story in a commencement speech, and I want to share it with you now. And if you've heard it before, it's really one of my favorites. So, and I quote, "There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, 'What the hell is water?'" And the point of that fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. And that quote rings true because in order to talk about how we change our community as arts educators, we need to talk about what's wrong and broken. And oftentimes, our students are the ones that are bringing that to our attention. And we need to listen to them. In the space between where our students are bringing problems to our attention and our desire to be the best educators we can be is often the communication breakdown. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick, if you are physically able today, a small muscle group and start flexing it when I say go, and hold it until I say stop. Ready? Go. This flexes your defensiveness. It takes a lot of energy to be defensive. I interact with educators who are directly benefiting from white supremacist, heteronormative, misogynistic, ageist, and sizist cultures that we all have inherited in the arts community. And many of those educators would rather not look at the water and just keep swimming because they aren't the ones drowning. And the way they do that is they gaslight, they deny, and they block conversations with defensiveness. But defensiveness, denying things that make us uncomfortable, and our unwillingness to sit with our own discomfort is what stops productive conversations from happening. Defensiveness, taking up space in our cultural conversation to acquit yourself, is deadly. So we're joined in this room because we don't want to do that. We want to fix those problems specifically in this moment. And I'm here because I am white and I have benefited from a white supremacist system, which afforded me the education to be here today. And now I'm going to spend my life acknowledging and tearing down that system and building one another where we can all achieve. But we can't do that without defensiveness being not part of this anymore. Okay, you can stop. You can unflex. Take a breath. Doesn't it feel good not to fight so hard? Doesn't it feel better to sit and listen and allow yourself the space for divine defensive-free discomfort? We were flexing because in this room we are all buds tightly wrapped, and we must look inward before we can take our next steps to unfurl our very intentional beliefs into the community. So if you feel yourself getting defensive today when confronted by a student about problematic practices in your studio, take a breath and make sure that you don't more tightly flex and wrap yourself up in that isolated bud, because it does not feel good. And then if you wrap yourself so tightly, you'll never have the opportunity to flower. Flexing your defensiveness doesn't make the problem go away. I kept talking about all of the problems while you were flexing. It just causes you tension. But sitting with your discomfort is another way of giving yourself divine space to be educated. which means you're allowing your students the freedom to speak out when they need to without fear of repercussion. And that is how we can change arts educational institutions, giving students autonomy and power, because they are there as co-collaborators with us. We can't be arts educators without students, and violence against students is not a student problem. It is an educator problem. So that is unpacking our divine defensive-free discomfort. And the next thing we're going to talk about is unpacking our implicit bias. Because this is what I was talking about, the inherited misogyny, sexism, white supremacy that we've inherited in our language system, because it's the language we speak, and it is the reflection of the history that we have in the United States. Implicit bias, as defined by the Anti-Defamation League, is the unconscious attitude, stereotype, and unintentional actions that are positive or negative towards members of a group merely because of their membership in that group. They are often in conflict with our overt perception of a group and ourselves. So even if we're saying, I'm not racist, our implicit bias may be, and here is why. Implicit bias is an evolutionary biological imperative. So that means that we don't have any control over it. It is what we inherited from our ancestors.
Okay, maybe this thing shouldn't be here all the time.
Everything okay?
Sorry.
We've inherited implicit bias from our ancestors. And we developed this as humans because we receive about 11 million pieces of information at any given time, and we can only process 40 of them. So in order to make sense of the world around us, our brain developed systems that help us categorize pieces of information by recognizing patterns. For instance, if I ask you to look at the faces you see in your Zoom meeting and categorize people by black or white, we do that fairly quickly because it is a system we've inherited in our implicit bias. Sorting by color is a biological imperative that kept our ancestors safe, whether it was identifying food, finding shelter. If I ask you to now look at the names on the Zoom meeting of everyone and sort them by letter, that's going to take a lot longer because that is not a system that we inherited. The Phoenicians invented this kind of alphabet that we use today. That's not part of our implicit bias. That is a learned trait. And that is an example of how we can be cognizant of our implicit bias to remove it from the equation. So, our implicit bias is often, unfortunately, for people that look like us. And our country has used implicit bias against us to preach and indoctrinate discrimination against the BIPOC community in both subvert and overt ways. So in order to undo our implicit bias, we need to sit with our divine discomfort, and we need to recognize that in the United States specifically, we come from a racist country and systems built around overt white supremacy, and that has leaked into our brains to reinforce and control our explicit bias and implicit bias to favor white bodies. And one way we can dismantle racism is to break through our implicit biases. And there's a great tool to do that. There are free quizzes online, and if you look in your resource guide, you can see them. Project Implicit was founded in 1998 by 3 scientists from the University of Washington, Harvard University, and the University of Virginia. And Project Implicit Mental Health was kind of launched on top of that in 2011. And what they have found in their 20 plus years of research from folks taking these quizzes and participating in this study, they found that implicit biases are pervasive. They found 75 to 80% of self-identified whites and Asians show an implicit preference for racially white people to racially Black people. Most folks are unaware of their biases. This is the second thing they found. They harbor the negative association subconsciously, even if honestly at the surface, they don't report these biases. And implicit bias predicts behavior. So there are different and varying levels of implicit bias, but those with higher level of implicit bias display greater discrimination towards people unlike themselves. So how does this affect us as educators? There's a great study from Georgetown Law Center on poverty and inequality, and they explained it really well. The result of this study is student discrimination because of implicit bias. It may not even be something we are conscious of doing. Their study in Georgetown Law Center revealed, and I quote, Black girls were more likely to be viewed as behaving and seeming older than their stated age, and this dynamic plays out in girls as young as 5 years old. End quote. That is an incredibly violent way of looking at potentially who is a person in your class, even though we're not cognitively aware of it. The American Psychological Association also released a study a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I quote, Black boys and men were perceived to be older and less innocent than white boys and men, end quote. And this is the reality that we very devastatingly see playing out in our country every day. So how is this implicit bias killing equity in our classrooms? Sit with your discomfort, and I will ask you to visualize something, and you can answer it for yourself. What's the implicit bias in your classroom? I want you to look and visualize students who stand in the front of the room, students who are given solos, your competition teams, however this makes sense to you. Is that a positive implicit bias because we are integrating things, because it is an equitable area? Or is it something that you are identifying now as you imagine your studio and you would like to alter in some way? Because we can learn to think before we react and speak, so we can use our conscious brain to kind of stop and check our implicit biases. But we have to know what our implicit biases are. So that's why that quiz and that link to those implicit bias quizzes are so valuable, because you can't unpack something that you don't know you have. And in many of my talks, we do, and I feel bad we can't do it here, but I am so grateful that you're all here today, kind of breakout rooms to discuss our implicit biases. But what I'm going to do to expedite this so we can cover as much as we can is share with you some of the results that other studio owners and other arts educators have come up with from those breakout sessions. So many folks identified that if a Black student spoke out to challenge them, that only white girls were getting soloed, that Black student was labeled as a troublemaker. So how do we give them an equal place in the conversation? We sit with our divine discomfort. Does your studio believe victims? If your studio has a uniform tight and shoe color or a hair policy, does that policy inherently favor white students over Black students? Because that makes Black students work twice as hard and BIPOC students work twice as hard to find lines in the mirror. Are you labeling students technically inadequate based on their body type rather than actual ability? So those are some of the questions and conversations that came up in those breakout groups that I wanted to share with you. And as arts institutions get called out for years of predatory and racist behaviors, it seems like the first thing that they do is amass a legal army They then go on the defensive, which escalates the situation by making the individual calling out the bias and the bad behavior scream to be heard, which only further hurts the victim. But if we identify our implicit bias and we are willing to sit with our discomfort, we break the cycle of violence. So sitting with our implicit bias and using our divine defensive-free discomfort to listen to our students are two really great tools to change the conversation about how we run our classrooms. I hope you can see how those two tools put together would change a conversation with a student that needs to be heard. So definitely something I encourage. Go visit Project Implicit, take that 10-minute quiz. I know we're all incredibly busy right now, but if you have time to scroll on Facebook for a little while or go on Instagram, you definitely have time to go take one of those quizzes, because uncovering your subconscious reactions to students based on race will create a more equitable studio. It could save a life, and it will help you acknowledge and run more equitable arts institutions. And there's a lot of resources I know I attached there as well, but just for time's sake, I'll leave those resources on the resource sheet. I will also add the Georgetown study. Thank you for pointing that out. So I will go back, and this will be a living document for us to continue this conversation well after this talk is over. So I have found, specifically in my studio teaching, as well as for other arts organizations coming together to create corporate governance, a place that implicit bias really rears its head is how we discipline and structure the rules of our studio learning spaces. So sit with your discomfort, and I'll ask you, how did you come up with your studio rules? Because I know when I inherited an arts education program, in traditional education institutions, we see those lists of rules plastered on the wall. And when I got hired at many of the places where I work, that list of rules was already on the wall before I entered the room. And so I want to ask you, go ahead and type in some of the rules that you see in classrooms. What are some of those rules that you see in classrooms or that you have in your studio? This can be traditional learning settings like a public school. No talking. Perfect. So as they come in, I'm just going to kind of acknowledge them. No talking, arrive to class on time, show up on time, no jewelry, respect for everyone, dress code. Yes, dress code. Hair in a bun. Dance teacher is always right. Proper shoes. No gum. Yes, no gum. Perfect. So this is, and I will keep acknowledging them in no back talk. Perfect. So these are some of the rules that are coming in that I wanted to start to talk about. If everyone can see the chat, you can actually start to see patterns in the rules. No back talk is, I understand the root of that rule, and we all do. It is to create a safe space. It is to create an era of respect. But the language that you use to articulate the rule either diminishes student power or gives students agency in how they navigate your studio space. So no back talk also could, I have seen it in many arts educational institutions, create a underground murmur of a dialogue of problems that never get addressed at a higher level. So how can we change the wording of no back talk, to a place of what it actually intends to be, which is respecting each other and listening and engaging, but also maintaining safety. Because I know that is kind of a juxtaposition that we need to find as arts educators, and it can be really hard. So those rules that we've inherited, those rules that we have, are valuable for safety. I acknowledge that they are valuable for safety, but something that you can do in your classroom, in your studio, is to start talking about community agreements. We as artists oftentimes are asked to be super vulnerable in our arts educational spaces. And that can be really difficult when you're also being forced to advocate for yourself and for your needs. So many of the standard rules we use today in teaching come from that implicit bias and a desire to control rather than to create a positive educational environment. And one of the ways that we can dismantle this is to have students create a community agreement, which actually replaces this traditional set of rules. And they're not to replace the foundations of dance training, but rather to guide behavior from a culturally conscious place and encouraging true equity among students rather than using the rules set up to applaud compliance and a lack of autonomy. It's a big responsibility to come up with these rules that govern a studio, and many studio rules, unfortunately, with dress code and hair policy, can be really troubling for BIPOC students, gender nonconforming students who struggle with the dress code. There are a myriad reasons why those rules might not work for everyone. And when the student talks back out about why that rule doesn't work for them, I have seen students be labeled difficult to work with just so they can be silenced. So removing the rules and replacing them with this collective community agreement is a way to reflect a microcosm of our American culture now and where we're going. Our country is making moves on justice reform and stripping corrupt law enforcement of power and investing that power in communities. And rules are a mandate enforced by authorities that don't reflect the will of the group. But a community agreement, as defined by the National Equity Project, are about how we want to be in relationships with each other. Speak your truth, be present. And agreements are that aspiration or the collective vision for how we want to be in a relationship with one another. They are explicitly developed and enforced by the group, not an external authority, and as such must represent a consensus. I know this is a radical departure from many studio rules, but it's a really valuable way when you are asking artists to be so super vulnerable and have such an environment of trust. It's a really radical and positive way that you can, in your arts educational institution, make a more equitable and democratic space. Those rules are also easier to uphold because the community has agency and a desire to activate those rules. So rule suggestions, she's got a bad attitude, not paying attention, all of those things then go away if we have community rules, because everyone has that same shared understanding of what the culture in your classroom needs to be. And I'm not saying just hand over the rules to the students, I'm saying be an active part of the community of your classroom, removing that hierarchy of you are the teacher and they are the students, which removes power from the students. Give them agency in their arts education and give them the space to ask questions. It can be a really transformative and very powerful thing. So the link on the resource sheet to the National Equity Project goes in more depth of how to explain and develop those community agreements. And I know that it's difficult to take time out of arts education where we feel like we have so few moments with our students and so much to impart. It can feel vulnerable to take the time to do that. But I have found that it is always worth it because it returns itself tenfold in love to the climate of your classroom. So we've talked a lot about divine defense of free discomfort, identifying and responsibly dismantling our implicit bias so we can create equity among our students. And then we came up with a new studio governance structure of community agreement. And now I kind of want to imagine ourselves in that direct student interaction, confronting something that I call the ABC of arts educations. So I have been in arts education systems since I was 7 years old. How many of us have gone through a camp of some sort, classes of some sort, higher educational learning institutions of some sort, apprenticeships, and then taken over studio spaces, and we've created those systems of our own. So way too often, I see that specifically higher educational institution portion do something called the bad ABCs of arts education, and that is to appropriate, to belittle, and to cancel. And even if you think you're doing the most and you are imparting everything to your students, how many of us are familiar with the phrase, the show must go on? It belittles student trauma, and it teaches them that they do not own or have autonomous control over their body. You do. How many of us have heard, well, that's the way it is, or that is what it is. I don't have control over that in our arts educational institutions. That is someone with control putting up that defensive wall and not acknowledging their implicit bias and the system of violence they inherited. How many of us have had a teacher come over and grab us in a vulnerable spot to make a correction? Or how many of us have done this to a student? That teaches students that their body is something we need to correct and shape. Their body is something we as educators have stake in. Their body is ours to control and not autonomously theirs. And that can be really dangerous, because if we teach students that they no longer have ownership over their body and they implicitly allow consent, it can get really dangerous for their lives. How many of us, when a student advocates for their needs, have ever heard in our educational systems someone just call them difficult, or that's not how it works in the real world, and I'm here to tell you how it works in the real world? That's canceling that student. It is negating that student's experience and denying them their trauma. And absolutely, I agree, it is a very thin line. You need to correct their bodies in ballet, but we're going to talk about consent every time you touch a student. And I know that this can be something that is really kind of revolutionary and groundbreaking for many ballet instructors, but consent is a very quick moment with your student that shows them that you are going to replace those ABCs of arts education with these ABCs of arts education that we can create together. Attend. A is for attend. And attend replaces the word instruct, because instruct implies the social hierarchy of student over teacher. And attend, the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of attend, is to give practical help, to care for, and to look after. And how much more powerful and equalizing is that? We need to attend to our students, not instruct them. We need to see who they are and what they need to learn from us. And part of what we can do, absolutely, I see it here, as I always say when I am going to place my hand on a student prior to doing it, and thank you for that comment, I also challenge you for victims of sexual trauma or for victims of, for folks that struggle with body dysmorphia. Do you say when you're going to place your hand on that student and allow them to say no? Or do you open up the space for them to say, could you show me that in a different way? Or could you even use a tool to separate your hand from my body? Is that a space that you allow your students? I know it's a very difficult conversation to have because I know how pivotal and critical it can be to touch a student in a class. I'm encouraging us, because we are artists, to think about creative ways to solve that problem. So the ABCs of arts education: attend. B is build up. So rather than tearing down that student body, how can we encourage, this is a big conversation going on in the dance community right now, and I oh, sorry, I got a question. Do you feel there's a difference between a student you have been training for 10 years? For example, if you have that trust, that consent is something you continue to revisit. Consent is always something you continue to revisit. Consent is never a blanket moment. I think looking at this, and thank you for that vulnerable question. If you've been training a student for 10 years, consent is the daily activity. Do I have permission to touch you? Or can I correct this? Or I'll put my hand here if that's okay with you. It's the way we ask that. Comfort is what you get from that 10 years. The comfort and the trust from that student that you have their best interest at heart because you've attended them, you've built them up, you've gotten consent, you used those 3 ABCs of new cultural equity in our classrooms and the new ABCs of arts education. So I hope that that answers your question a little bit, but consent is something, especially in today's society, we need to, as arts educators, iris out of our institutions and look at how, by demanding implicit consent of our students, it can be dangerous for the rest of their lives. Perfect, thank you. So we've attended, we have built it up, and we have asked for consent of our students. And if a student says, yeah, ask, everything always changes. That is absolutely right. It can change on a day-to-day, a second-to-second motion, which is why it's really important to always keep that dialogue going with your students. And that portion of consent of the new ABCs of arts education, it's that radical removal of implied consent of physical contact between instructor and student, because their body is their own, which also means that, much like those community agreements, they now have more of an invested stake in their body because they are the ones controlling it, because you're attending to their body that they have power over, rather than instructing their body because what they have brought into the room is either incorrect, wrong, or any of the other negative connotations that can go with that. It's a very fine line, and this is why the language we use is so important, because the language we use has connotation. I say it's kind of like Newton's law of language. Everything you say has an equal and opposite reaction or connotation. So if you're saying, oh, that's wrong, a student may hear, your leg is wrong for dance, instead of attending to the student and asking consent and saying, this is a great place to start, and let's build from here. And I'm going to offer you these corrections to help you move safely. So The last thing I want to talk about, and I know that we have kind of whipped through a lot of information and taken a lot of turns in a very short amount of time. And thank you for being so open, sitting with your discomfort, and being willing to have those vulnerable conversations. Oh, a question came in. We asked the student, they may not be able to give an honest answer based on things like peer pressure. That is absolutely right. It's challenging to teach how to advocate for yourself because I ask a student if it's okay for hands-on correction based on previous experiences they may not feel safe to decline. I'm curious on how to help people ask for what they need and how to empower their voices. Community agreements. That's exactly how you do it. Because if you acknowledging that, and thank you for sharing that very vulnerable moment. If you and your community agreement sit down in your studio and say, okay, here's what I understand from my years as an arts educator. Peer pressure kills body autonomy. How do we change that in our 5 people, in our 10 people, in our community? Use that as part of your community agreement to say it's always okay to say no. Do you know how powerful it is for a young artist and a young person to hear it's always okay to say no from someone who they look up to so much like you? So thank you for asking that question and sharing that vulnerable moment. The very last thing I want to talk about is, oh, there's so much more to get through. I want you to be aware of coded language in your classroom. And there are coded language resources attached to that sheet that I sent off with you. It is language that substitutes terms describing racial identity with seemingly race-neutral terms that disguise explicit or implicit racial biases. For instance, how many of us have worked with underserved communities? So by saying underserved communities, we're only acknowledging the effect of the problem, but not the cause. A community is underserved because of white supremacy and systemic violence. So how do we change that language in our classroom to make sure that our coded language isn't promoting any sort of negative connotation? It's that Newton's law of language. What you say has an equal or opposite connotation. Some other things are inner city schools or urban, especially urban in the dance community. If you're saying urban, you need to make sure that you are actually defining the term that you mean rather than removing the community from the event. So if you're saying, oh, well, we're doing something in a more urban style, what does that mean? Does that mean you are utilizing West African dance? Does that mean you're doing hip hop? Are you explaining the cultural context of what you are doing? And very quickly, the last thing I want to talk about, so we've done coded language, are pronouns. It's another way to attend to your students. Eliminating coded language is a way to attend to your students, and incorporating pronouns into your studio. And this is a pretty easy one, which is the nice part. According to the Trevor Project, an estimated percentage of youth 19 to 24 who identify as LGBTQIA+, there are 9.6% of youths ages 18 to 24 identified as LGBTQIA+. And 7.8 identify as bisexual, 1.8 identified as homosexual, gay, lesbian, and 2% of high school students every year identify as transgender. Out of that ratio, 35% have attempted suicide in the past year. So I know that's a really hard thing to kind of hear, especially when there's only 3 minutes left, but there is the simplest way to correct that in 3 minutes. If you incorporate pronouns into your studio literature and every time you introduce yourself, you are looking at your non-binary and transgender students and saying, you matter, And I am going to recognize your need in this conversation in our studio for you to feel safe to identify your gender identity. So even just putting out, my name is Shannon, my pronouns are she, her, it is a 2-second way to retrain yourself to be more inclusive of the LGBTQIA plus community in your classrooms. So that is a crazy amount of information I threw at you. But use these ABCs of arts education to acknowledge the systems we have and then make new systems of your own. What I gave you, I'm intentionally just calling a worksheet. It's a document. It's a collective of ideas. And this work that we're doing today and over the next 4 days, and then for the rest of our lives, isn't going away. So what I can encourage you and what I want to leave you with is don't do this work in secret. Don't come to Forward Movement and then say, oh, I saw all these great classes. Show your students by showing them what language you're using. Because when Gandhi asked, what is your message? His answer was my life. So you have to lead by example and let your students see you doing the work. Because if you achieve in secret, you are a pond. But if you teach your students how to do the work, you've created an ocean of change. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to my talk today. I am extremely grateful for all of you. This document is going to continue to live, and I will continue to add things to it. I am going to comb through our group chat, ask for things that you need from me. Use your agency and ask for things that you need from me. And please know that this conversation will continue, and I hope that I can still be a resource for you through this document. Thank you so much, everyone. I am sending my gratitude and my love to you all, and I really look forward to seeing you over the next 4 days. Bye.
Thank you to Shannon, and know that you guys, if you have more questions that you can't fit into the chat today, you can go ahead and email Kristen at liberateartist.com. Her name should be on a lot of things already, but she will be composing them and sending them off to Shannon, who can get you back your answers as well. Thank you for being here today, guys, and thank you so much, Shannon. That was beautiful.
Thank you, everyone.